Hello and welcome to everyone joining us from around the world for this timely and important webinar, the 10th in our Solidarity 2020 and Beyond series, Voices from the Field. This week, we're celebrating Human Rights Week, and December 10th is actually Human Rights Day, with a cutting-edge discussion on improving transitional justice with people-powered transformative justice, a grassroots perspective. And over the course of the panel, you'll understand what that means and hear a little bit more about how important that is. The webinar is co-hosted with our partners, Waging Nonviolence, and also International Network of Victims and Survivors, INAVOS, which is a relatively new international network of victims and survivors, but actually it's their year anniversary. And we have many co-founders here on the panel today. I'm Catherine Hughes-Freytek, and I'm founder and director of Solidarity 2020 and Beyond. As we get started, go ahead and post in the chat box, some of you already have, what your name is, where you're joining us from. And our series centers and amplifies the voices of grassroots activists, journalists, trainers, and scholars. Experienced panelists have shared their knowledge and expertise about the nuts and bolts of how to wage constructive and successful nonviolent campaigns and movements for change. We're looking forward to learning and sharing today. Eric?
Hi, I'm Eric Stoner, one of the co-founders and editors of Waging Nonviolence, an online publication that covers social movements and activism around the world. I'm really thrilled to be a part of this webinar today because we're always looking to explore the types of topics and questions that we'll be discussing. I want to go over the structure for today's webinar panel with some guidelines and procedures. First, we are streaming live on Zoom and Facebook Live, and we will be monitoring comments and questions from both platforms. This event is being recorded, and by participating, you are agreeing to the webinar being reposted on YouTube channels for Waging Nonviolence and Solidarity 2020 and Beyond. This panel is scheduled to go for 90 minutes and will include brief presentations and overviews by the panelists, and then questions and answers and comments from you, the webinar participants. If you have questions, please text them into the chat section. And when called upon by the moderator, you have the option of unmuting and asking your question or comment directly. We know people have different perspectives and positions, and welcome those, but we ask that you communicate these respectfully, or we will delete comments and or remove you from the event. You'll receive a link to share the recording of this program after it's complete and can sign up or more. Now I'll turn it back to Catherine from Solidarity 2020 and Beyond. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. Great to have you all as partners, as always. I'd like to take a quick minute to tell you all a little bit about the work of Solidarity 2020 and Beyond. We're a broad international network of grassroots campaigns and movements based in 75 plus countries around the world, representing more than 100 movements struggling for freedom, rights, justice, and peace. These grassroots communities are working on many issues that are interconnected: environmental justice and against climate change, women's rights and gender justice, racial and caste justice, transitional and transformative justice, self-determination, land rights and indigenous rights, and democratization and anti-corruption goals. We believe in the power of ordinary people to organize and mobilize to change injustices in our local communities and, by extension, the world. We believe that this pandemic and now the war in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, are triggering moments, causing more challenges and danger in the world, but also with the possibility of new realities and transformational change. We'd love you to check out our website at www.solidarity2020andbeyond.org, and we'll put that in the chat box, and like us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram as we amplify the amazing work and lessons learned of nonviolent organizers around the world. I want to thank our great team, Assistant Director Steve Chase International Outreach and Development Deputy Reem Ghanaim, and our interns program assistants from around the world, Salsa, Kisi, Diana, Tom, Annabelle, Catherine, and Sarah, many are who are assisting today. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Ariel Dulitzky from the University of Texas at Austin, who will be our moderator today and will introduce himself and the 3 additional panelists from Innovas in more detail. I'm extremely happy to be hosting this webinar, which features the extraordinary Ram Bandari from Nepal, co-founder of Innovas, and an amazing and strategic activist who has been active with Solidarity 2020 and beyond from the beginning. And also to be reconnected with Professor Dulitzky, who served on the Peace Brigades International USA National Lawyers Committee for Human Rights when I served as their executive director. I'm also so excited to be meeting and learning from our new partners, Ahmad Helmi from Syria and Marjorie Jobson, an amazing activist over the years from South Africa. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Dulitzky, and we'll get started with the panel. It'll be very interactive, and when you have questions, just get them in the chat, as Eric said, and/or you can ask them in person, and this will be a very great interactive webinar. So let's get started. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and welcome everybody. Thank you to Katie, Steve, and Eric for the invitation. I appear in the flyer as the professor. In fact, I consider myself and identify myself as an activist working in an academic setting. Today we have a great panel. I'm not going to provide details or anything about the 3 panelists because I'm not going to make justice to the amazing work that they are doing, and I will let them to self-identify. I think that is more appropriate. The topic of our panel today is moving from the transitional justice framework to one transformative justice, and particularly to placing grassroots organizing at the center of our work. I'm really looking forward to this panel, and let me give you some of my perspective very briefly, so as a way to introduce and maybe pose some questions to our panelists. First, I believe that going back to the idea of transformative justice is essential for many reasons. First one, it recovers the political reasons and struggles that are at the basis of the human rights abuses. For years and years, we transformed the victims of human rights abuses into an abstract category with no political agency. By talking about transformative justice, we recover the political fight that many of the victims and survivors were engaged with and were the reasons for the human rights abuses and the repression. Second, the approach to transformative justice requires us to address the structural issues, the root causes of the human rights abuses. And unless we address that, we are not going to be able to prevent further violations or to properly remedy the human rights abuses that already took place. And the third one is the concept of the remedy and proper reparation. We need to move from a framework that is restoring rights to transforming realities. We cannot say that if we started with an unjust society, a proper human rights reparation is to go back to that unjust structure. So we need to think what it means, transformative justice, from the perspective of the right to reparations and remedy. And in a nutshell, that will have implications also in terms of the type of human rights advocacy that we do and the human rights organizing that we do. Maybe the traditional approach from a purely legal perspective is not going to be enough. Maybe even the legal framework that we use is not enough. Maybe the type of coalition and network that we create is not enough, that we need to incorporate new stakeholders, but also we need to look at who is responsible for this. And probably our narrow approach to the perpetrators should be expanded. And maybe those who benefit from these human rights violations should be included in this approach. And at the end of the day, we need to move in part from recognition to redistribution, as Fraser said. So with this brief introduction, I will move to the panelists, because that's the purpose of our panel. We will start with Ahmad, then Marjorie, and then Ram. They will speak, each of them, for 10 to 15 minutes, and that will leave us with around 30 minutes for questions and comments. Please, as Eric said, raise your hands if you have a comment, and I will be moderating that part of the web seminar. So let's start with Ahmad. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ariel, and thank you everyone for taking your time. I'm really happy to speak with you today. I'm Ahmad Helmi. I am a Syrian nonviolent activist and a survivor of some atrocities in Syria. And I'm founder and manager of Ta'afi Initiative, a human rights organization centered and led by survivors. And I'm a co-founder of Innovaz, the international network, though I would say one of a kind, international network of victims and survivors from around the globe. So when we talk about justice, there are many things that comes to our mind. Mainly it is coming from academia, from all the practices. You know, when you talk about justice, you can imagine only a court, right? A judge, someone with a hammer, you know, and in bars, prison. But when you think about justice, you know, like if I ask you now to just create a cloud in your mind and imagine what justice is, that what most probably will you will see, but you will never see the victim in that picture. And that is one of the main new aspect that we are trying to bring to the table with Innovaz, with Ta'afi, with the victims movements in Syria, which I will tell you a little bit about later on. We need that a transformative justice should focus on victims, communities, and perpetrators in the same level. You know, it's not only about punishing perpetrators; it's also about compensations and remedy for victims. It's also about reintegration of society. In 2012, in 2011, I was in a peaceful demonstration. We organized the demonstration in Syria. We're calling for democracy, for freedom, for human rights, you know, to abolish torture in prisons, and we were holding roses. In that demonstration, we were attacked by the Syrian army. And it was the first time they attack us with that much of violence. I was standing there and I heard a voice, and like it was like really weird. And after that, I stopped hearing anything. I was shooted by a sniper in my face. I know you are looking, you're saying, "Oh, you have pretty face." It's underneath, and thank you. And it broke my face. It broke my spinal nerve, and like it ruined my life. Later on, I was in 2012 going to the university after I recovered from the bullet and from the shot, and I was arrested by the Syrian intelligence. I spent 3 years in enforced disappearance, torture, sexual violence, arbitrary detention, and I was released. That is not the point. The point is, I was asked by someone, if we get you the guy who tortured you and the guy who shot you, what would you do? And I was thinking, so if I got the guy who shot me, should I punish the bullet or the weapon who released the bullet or the finger who triggered the weapon or the guy who made the order to the finger or the general who made the order or to the general who made the order? There is a chain of orders. If I want justice from them, I need to put everyone behind bars, and maybe I need to punish everyone. But would that bring me peace? No, it wouldn't. If I got the guy who tortured me, if I torture him back, would I get peace? No, I wouldn't. If I put him behind bar, is that enough? No, it's not enough, because we are talking about system, we are talking about the system of violence. If we can't change the system, the atrocities and the violation that we have lived will not mean anything. So for victims to feel the restorative justice, it's a comprehensive process that will cover all aspects: punishing perpetrators, remedy for victims, and reintegration and community cohesion, with holding in mind that with everything should aim to a guarantee of non-reoccurrences. Myself, the 3 years I spent in prison won't mean anything if I know that it will happen to others. But if I make sure that what happened to me will not happen to anyone else in the future, I will have my remedy. I will have peace. I will know that it didn't go for nothing. Yeah. So coming from that perspective, and I ask Ariel, if when I get close to my time, just give me a flag or just mute me. I like to talk too much, and that because I spent the 3 years in prison just listening, and so I have too much built-in power to talk. So I just like to talk. So coming from that background, together with 10 Syrian family associations, we came together, we started to work, to coordinate, and we felt there is a bond, between us. And we thought, like, we are always been told in Syria that justice is criminal accountability. Everything will end when we hold perpetrators behind bars. And, we lived with that fact until a point in 2019 when we started to think, what is justice for us? And that question was the most annoying question I've ever heard, because we spent 2 years developing what is our vision for transitional justice in Syria. We have created the Truth and Justice Charter, which is our vision. What is a priority? What is a long term? What is a short term? What should be built on what and where and when, And that created a roadmap of justice, of transitional justice, based on what victims need, based on what justice will truly mean in the future. And we started acting on it. We started acting on it. And when we talk about grassroots movements, like we think that it's community mobilization maybe, but in Syria it was like far from that. After we released the Truth and Justice Charter, after we had our priorities set in mind, we thought that our first priority is to reveal the fate and whereabouts of the missing. And how we would do that? We made a study, we issued a study proposing a new institution under the UN umbrella to work and to search and to reveal the fate and fate and whereabouts of the disappeared in Syria. And at the beginning, no one listened to us. You know, my partner says that she hears the words an international institution to reveal the fate and whereabouts in the house more than she hears her own name. And yeah, she's right. We have been talking about this for 3 years, but with the persistence and with our hard-headed approach, we made it to the international attention. Last year, we influenced the UN General Assembly resolution to ask the Secretary General to conduct a feasibility study on our proposal. The feasibility study happened with our participation because we had in the language victim participation in the process. The process happened with our participation, and by last August, we had a report from the Secretary General endorsing our proposal, saying in the recommendation of the report that we need a new institution under the UN to reveal the fate and whereabouts of the missing. And we are super close to achieve that. So we're talking about an idea that became a new institution coming only from Syrian victims, from grassroots movement. And that only happened because we had partners from victims movements from around the world. We had Innovas to support us with their connection, our members with their connections. We had people in Argentina and Guatemala and Colombia and Uruguay in around the world supporting our effort because they believed that what justice is what victims envision and what the victims need. I think, yeah, I'm about to cross my line.
You have 3 more minutes.
3, okay, very good.
Yeah.
Okay, another story. Thank you. So yeah, to conclude, that's what I'm trying to say about transformative justice. It's something should happen with victims, with community. It's something you build it from the bottom up. It's not something you impose it on any context. You can't bring a vision or a roadmap from different conflict from a conflict to conflict. Every conflict has its own sensibility and its own context and background. Yeah, so that is what transformative justice for me. It's to focus on to see the victims in the map in the image you draw to yourself when you think about justice. It's not only about perpetrators behind bars. It's a comprehensive approach to build the satisfaction. I always say satisfaction is just like your mobile phone battery. You know, it charges when you provide remedy for victims, when you provide accountability, when you have guarantees of no reoccurrences. When you build those steps, you will build the battery, 1% by 1% until you get to a level when you can sustain peace. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Ahmad, for this powerful presentation. Great way to start. And let's move on to Marjorie Jobson, please.
I am Marjorie Jobson. I am the National Director of the Victims Movement in South Africa called Khulumani Support Group. And Khulumani means to speak out. And the movement is a movement of anti-apartheid activists in a struggle that has gone on for decades. We have an incredible story of basically resistance to apartheid, to colonialism. I mean, for me, the proudest thing was that there was a 100-year conflict in the Eastern Cape where the colonialists, the British, were trying to dominate and subordinate the local people, the Xhosa people, and they fought 9 frontier wars, and it took them 100 years to finally win territory, win land, and everything they learned was what they then, as colonialists, applied everywhere else. They colonized the world. So we have this incredible history, and I think that is what has shaped so much of the movement of survivors in Khulumani. I just wanted to not go into too much of the historical detail, but just to say that, there was what is remarkable to me is that there was ethics of war that were practiced by the indigenous people that were never honored by the British colonialists, which were mainly military, attempts to dominate people, so that they would never harm women and children. They would never destroy crops, because they said after any war, and there were 9 of these frontier wars, there will be survivors and people will need to eat. And those are not the principles that inform warfare today. And I think it's so important for us to recover those kinds of principles. And so Khulumani was founded at the transition. We were launched in 1995 after these negotiations sort of added on the idea that there should be a truth commission, and the Truth Commission would hear testimony from victims and survivors. In fact, they only heard 2,000 testimonies orally, and they collected 17,000 statements, which is a fraction of the recognition of the extent of the resistance in the country. And the founders of Khulumani were in the beginning all women, which is extraordinary. We actually have about 65% of our members are women. And what the Truth Commission noticed was that women actually hardly ever presented what happened to them at the Truth Commission. It was always for their sons and for their husbands and spouses. And in fact, it took a sitting of 2 days of getting women to actually speak about what happened to them, which was appalling. And of course, it was rape, and it was before rape was recognized as a crime of war. So the silence is still extraordinarily deep around what happened to women, but women were the founders of Khulumani, and then they were joined by other political activists, especially the people who had been sentenced to death and were about to be executed on what we called our death row, where I was a part of the campaign that fought to stop the hangings, because it was clear that there was very, very unfair trials with very poor legal representation. And so some of those people who were released from death row because of that activism became founder members of Khulumani. And so, the big issue for us was that this Truth Commission that was added on to the end of the political negotiations was meant to provide a political reconciliation amongst elites. And that was about it, because elites were going to share the spoils. I mean, many of our people who are politicians now were handed huge amounts of shares, and they're very, very wealthy. They became overnight millionaires, and they still are. And so the division between sort of the political and the social has only grown after the transition, and that's a huge issue. And we remain the most unequal country in the world. So so this Truth Commission was being constructed with a draft bill without any involvement of victims and survivors. And that's what triggered people standing up and saying, you haven't even spoken to us. What do you think you're creating if you want us to participate? And so the founding group, it was very small in the beginning, like about 8 people who were volunteers for 3 years with no budgets. But the purpose was, if we are going to be heard, we have to be a collective voice. And then, well, they still didn't manage to have any input into this act that set up the Truth Commission, the Promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation Act. So that was the beginning. And these 8 staff members, all volunteer staff members, said, if we are going to have anything to do with this instrument called the Truth Commission, then we have a duty to go out and try and alert people that it's going to come, so that as many people as possible can be part of it. And all of that was volunteer work. And the 8 people took on covering different regions of the country. And then suddenly, after the Truth Commission started in 1996, it closed down for victims in 1997, and virtually everybody who should have had their cases registered by the Truth Commission were locked out. They called it, like, they slammed the door shut, and they decided they are never going to entertain the people who actually brought down the apartheid regime. Because the big struggle at the moment is to rewrite the narrative, and the narrative that the politicians wish to recognize is that the struggle was won by military veterans, combatants who joined the liberation armies. That wasn't who Kulumani members are. They were all community activists on the ground, and they had to protect their communities without arms from daily attacks by the apartheid military and security apparatuses. So it forged a very strong identity. We used to talk about it being, we were a movement of wounded healers. We are the people who know what needs to happen. These politicians are only interested in the economy and getting rich, which is what they've continued to do. But we can practice all the principles of solidarity, non-violence, and the need to recognize the contributions of all these thousands of ordinary people. And then if we're going to allow them to progress in their lives, we have to meet their urgent needs. And so when the Truth Commission closed, after taking only 21,000 statements, all of these people who had been conscientized through this activism of a small group of founder members contacted us and said, but we haven't registered our story. And so we formed we developed it, we refined it over time, but we created a needs assessment form so that people could register what happened, where it happened, who were the perpetrators, and what their needs are. And we fought for that ever since. We have that huge database, 130,000 records, and we fight for the promises that were made to the victims and survivors to be honored, which was based on, the politicians said, we will provide equal justice to all people. Well, that certainly hasn't happened. We will provide reparation. We learned that 2 years after the Truth Commission handed over its report, the politicians decide we will never honor reparations beyond those few people we documented. So that's where the huge failures have come. And so, what we knew is that the people who became Kulumani members were activists, social and political activists, and we thought that's the foundation on which we can build the movement. And we had adopted a new constitution in 1996 with a very, very good Bill of Rights. And so we designed projects based on how do communities on the ground give substance to the clauses in this Bill of Rights, which is all the access to water, to food, to health, to education, all of those things. And so depending on where they were, we started a process that we called building civic competence, and how communities could use the tools of community conversations to identify in their particular landscape what were their most urgent needs, and how do we develop projects in which they build their skills and are able to start through their own activism, meeting community needs. And I'm really grateful. We've done a huge amount of work like that. In fact, as government has become aware of this disaster of massive unemployment, we won a grant to expand our work in like getting unemployed people and especially unemployed youth into the social economy. So all the care work that happens, but training them into how they can become activists in the social economy. And the thing that we knew was that the wounding of this people of this country is extremely deep, and we see violence playing out. People respond violently. They were subjected to extraordinary violence every day of their lives in trying to defend their communities. And so we started to look at for ways of dealing with this in a community-based way. Unfortunately, all the universities with their psychology departments teach only individual psychotherapy model, and we realized that's never going to work in this country, you know. So we first encountered the model in Guatemala called Hearts, which is a narrative-based model where people start to understand that what was done to them was not their fault, and how you deal with the emotional fallout from it. And then from that, we moved into using a program developed by a psychiatrist, Sandra Bloom, and we found things were really beginning to move. We were managing to build solid communities on the ground, which was really important because in townships and rural villages, apartheid had infiltrated everywhere and it virtually destroyed all social capital in the country. So we had to build a process of how do we learn to trust each other? How do we learn to speak the truth to each other, whatever side of the conflict we've been on? How do we deal with all the loss we've suffered? How do we mourn the losses? And then how do we prepare for what our way forward is? So I was just thinking I'd quickly run through some of the campaigns that arose from this kind of orientation. And the first campaign was called Find Your Voice. And people, even today, they know that campaign. It was about, you know, the repression of apartheid silenced people. So to find your voice was critically important. And that is still sort of the basis of our work. Speak out, find your voice, share what happened to you. That's the beginning of healing. And then we embarked on an international lawsuit in the United States, in the New York, one of the New York district courts that went on for 14 years against multinational companies, because we had a section of our Truth Commission that had human rights hearings for companies, but not a single multinational company presented themselves to the Truth Commission. So we charged 23 multinational companies with aiding and abetting gross human rights violations in South Africa. We made immense progress. It was a wonderful rallying of people because so many people could identify with how they'd suffered under the mining industries, the motor industries in the country. And in fact, we still get a lot of claims from victims of these multinational companies. After 14 years, the US changed the legislation that allowed us to bring our case to a court in New York. And so we could not proceed further than that. But since then, we've had other campaigns. We decided to go around the country meeting with victim and survivor groups to say, what would redress look like to you? And we formulated a charter for redress. In South Africa, in the struggle, the liberation struggle, there were a series of charters. So charters spoke to the politicians in this country, but they have not honored the clauses of the Charter for Redress, but it was a very good organizing tool. Then we became involved with other organizations on constructing a charter for restitution, because white beneficiaries of apartheid have a huge role to play, but were scared off by things like the Truth Commission. And actually they first had to acknowledge that they were supreme beneficiaries of apartheid with its racial, basis in racial discrimination. And then we organized a campaign called Asikakeri, another Zulu word, which we said we need to go back and fill all these gaps that have been left by the Truth Commission. That ended up in our making many presentations in Parliament, still falling on deaf ears of these politicians. And presently we're building a campaign called the Campaign for Just Reparations. And so we have not stopped making a noise. In fact, one of our ministers of justice said, "You people are the biggest toothache in my mouth. You never go away." So we think that's such a wonderful image of perpetually being a pain in the neck, to politicians. But we are slowly gaining ground again because, there's a realization that having avoided making redress actually going back to colonialism and apartheid is never going to build a country that actually complies with the clauses of our constitution. So that's who we are. Yeah.
So Ram, please.
Thank you, Ariel. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. Where you are based. I'm from Nepal, and I'm a founder of Network of Families of the Disappeared in Nepal, and co-founder of International Network of Victims and Survivors of Serious Human Rights Abuses. We launched it officially last year on 8th December, today. And so I'm very happy to take part in this panel, as Ariel said, from the Global South. And this is already a transformative, from the very, westernized concept of institutional, conventional transitional justice to localized transformative justice. This is, only a one shift, we are shifting the paradigm from the failed, transitional justice approach to locally based transformative approach. I myself, victim and activist, actively involved in making grassroots movement and building coalitions around the country, around the region, and around the globe. So that's why I also represent Innovas, and including Nepal and South Asia. My work actually started at the grassroots as an activist in my community with the other victims and survivors from the conflict. Nepal went through a very violent conflict for 10 years from 1996 to 2006, for your reference. The work at the national level in Nepal and now at the international level has been driven by the understanding that addressing the needs of victims and survivors in my community involves being present in the capital and on a global stage. This was driven by the need to be a part of coalitions. That how I believe in coalition building and power of solidarity. This is very important for small victim groups or national movements or the global movement. And then these are very important. And then I think in Nepal's conflict, we have so many learnings, and lesson learned in the past 20 years. When I involved from very early 2001 at the peak of conflict, and also in the post-conflict after 2006 comprehensive peace agreement, we have different lived experiences from victims' perspective, and also we have witnessed how the other actors, both the national actors and external actors, how they have mobilized, the transitional justice advocacy from their perspective, and then how did we perceive, from the local victims' perspective, and then we see that there are lots of, gaps, both in knowledge production, both in also in mobilization, and also reaching out to the marginalized communities and victims at the grassroots. And so there are so many problems. To my understanding, transitional justice has become a prescription tools, by the external actors, I think, to legitimate the post-conflict states. And then in our experiences, even in the post-conflict situations, we had some changes, at political level, and then we couldn't change the system. And it's like, regime change without regime change. That what I see in our context, where also I think transitional justice becomes more institutional and state-centric in our perspective. What we have witnessed elsewhere and also experienced in Nepal is It's a top-down, perpetrator-led, and very institutional, based in the capital with the limited premises, where victims has no access to I mean, also put their demands and then to play their role in the processes. So where, I mean, transitional justice bodies, for example, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Disappearance Commission, they are very limited in the small institutions in the capital and detached from the grassroots victims. And then we have very little access, and then we have very little achieved, from those processes. And these whole processes heavily controlled by state agents and politically instrumentalized. And the political power, they have used and abused victims, for their political benefits, but they never define their role, and then they never respect their role to play for the transitional justice processes. So institutional transitional justice is failing victims. I mean, we experience victims on the ground are moving forward. I mean, we have done a lot. We have achieved so many little things, for our own satisfaction, through mobilization, through collective action, as a building solidarity discourse and then solidarity chain to support each other and then to gain agency from the grassroots. And so victims and survivors at the grassroots, they are building movement, which is bottom up, purely led by their own interest and needs. And victims and survivors at the ground, they have an alternative way of thinking. They have a vision. As Ahmad said, they also have a vision. They have their own perspective. They have their own language and terminologies to articulate their demands, from their needs and from their context where they are based. And for justice, as they define what justice means for them. And so there is an alternative to address victim needs and to involve them in these processes. In our context, state institutions, both the Truth Commission and the Disappearance Commission, fail to address transformative agenda of comprehensive peace agreement. And newly built state fail to change their institutions. So many alleged perpetrators are known in Nepal context. Those who still sit in position and who led the transition and set the agenda of transitional justice. That's our pure failure. So in the context of Nepal, I and other activists felt together a need of coalition to advance transitional justice advocacy from victims' perspective is mostly, need-based, and then context-specific. And what needs do, victims have in Nepal that cannot be addressed locally? This is a question. I think in terms of accountability, the state is unwilling to act. And so we need external pressure. That's why, we're more interested in solidarity building and the movement building from the ground. And transitional justice in Nepal are mostly driven by a global transitional justice discourse that is not victim-centered. We need to act to change that for victims in Nepal and elsewhere. This is a global challenge today. I think transitional justice today is in crisis. That's why we are discussing about the alternative that that must be, powered by the people, led by the grassroots, and transformative. Every process, it must carry the transformative agenda of the victims of the local communities and based on the national interest and the specific context. These are important issues. And on the other side, why do international non-government organizations need local victims to be a part of their coalitions? There are so many civil society coalitions that we see in Nepal and also in different contexts. I think everyone, they talk about they also try to ensure victim-centered approach for legitimacy and also to understand the needs on the ground, but forgetting the role of the local victims and their movement and their role in the coalition. I would say one of the most important issues is to acknowledge that such coalition always include a range of different interests that do not typically coincide. As such, there are a range of reasons that leads to a particular agenda being prioritized by the different interest groups. One important problem is that is the lack of victim voices taking part in the processes. This is very, important. In the best case, victims or affected populations are given agency, as Ariel said about how we can gain and strengthen political agency of victims. And this is political issues also, where the external actors, they don't consider victims as a political actors in the process. I think that is another challenge. Also,
Ram, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. And so there may be powerful CSOs, the civil society organization on the ground who can control the agenda and whose priorities may have local political influence and reflect other agendas to reflect global normative agendas of those international agencies and donors that cannot reflect the local victims' needs. And so I think overlying factor in creating viable coalitions really should be that all participants understand they are stronger together. This is more important that where we see the role of local grassroots victims and how we define the people power transformative justice. So we can transform and change the social phenomena and the process together as a stronger coalition. A strong voice for victims and local communities can give a contextualized understanding of needs and conditions, as well as legitimacy, both locally and internationally. I think most actors understand that participation of victims should be central. However, victims often lack resources of all sorts: technical, financial, political, and others. At national NGOs and international actors can assist the victims, bring those adequately to the table. But there are many challenges. And so an important role for such coalitions like International Network of Victims and Survivors, INNOVAS, is to link a range of local actors. Like, we are linking victims from, all corners of the world. This is already a powerful that, we can bring and bridge the local voices to the national level and the international policy platforms like this, who can convey our agendas and needs, and then who wouldn't otherwise be able to share experiences and support each other in other ways. So I think, the for such coalitions and the movement building, to be effective and for them to navigate of often extreme power differential that exists, and they sometimes subsume, they will need a strong normative foundation to their mission. This means not only global legal right norms, but also norms of participation, local ownership, and victim centrism. The latter can imply the need to resist representation as much as possible and allow victims to represent themselves. This should be a part of capacity building process, integral to any such coalitions. And so I think, and also to be dilemmas around funding and technical support, will have to be negotiated, where most funding is brought by internationals and powerful agents. But the agenda needs to be set by local victims, together to address their needs and the challenges. In the INNOVAS case, I see we have created a set of international locals. I would say, myself as my Ahmad Marjorie is here today as a co-founder of INNOVAS, and then in our team building process, I think we have created our space, victim space at international level, and then also we have created a set of international locals, people like myself, Ahmad, Marjorie, and other friends who come from a particular context. I'm from Nepal, Ahmad from Syria, and other friends from Argentina, Guatemala, and different contexts, and represent myself and other victims on a global stage. People like me and Ahmad are translators seeking to speak both local language of needs and perspective of the victims and struggle we have suffered from, and the global language of international law and global advocacy. So a coalition like INNOVAS is absolutely dependent on us keeping close to those we seek to represent, and not simply using our identity to gain legitimacy as another global actor, but to impacting in the process, also transforming ourselves as a primary actors to drive the transitional justice process and transformative justice process based on the local needs and also on the based on the ground realities. So these are our strength. And then also I stop here, and then I would like to interact if and there are some questions later. Thank you very much.
So we have a little bit of extra time, so I encourage everybody to raise your hands, write comments, write questions, and let me start with abusing of my role as a moderator. And my question is, how do we give voice to the victims of survivors? How do we avoid replicating the problems of transitional justice that we have in part the top-down approach and saying, okay, these are the representative of the victims, but we all know that the victims are not a unified voice. They have different perspectives, different strategies, different needs. So how do you approach this? How are you transforming the framework not to essentialize once more what it means to the victims as something abstract, but something real with all the differences and embracing that? Ahmad, I see your hand.
Yeah, it's very well and very hard question. So our approach in Ta'afi, we mobilize survivors of torture and for disappearance to join our advocacy work. So first we have categories, victims who are interested in advocacy, in lobbying, in activism, but they don't have the tools. Victims who are interested and have the knowledge and the tools to apply on activism, and those who are not interested and doesn't have the knowledge and the tools. So with those who are not interested, we can't do anything. They don't want to participate. For those who have the interest, we build their capacity. And for those who have the interest and the capacity, we engage them in our work. So this is our own approach. And you said something about victims are not united and they're not unified. And that is very normal, and that is the healthy practice. We are not talking about a parliamentary representation of victims. So Ta'afi doesn't represent Syrian victims, but we represent the victims in our network. When we work with 10 other Syrian families association, we don't represent all victims in Syria. We represent our networks, our extended networks, and that's it. But it was also a challenge to work with each other. We had, as Ta'afi, we are survivors. We had accountability as first priority, and we were focusing only on accountability, while the families of the disappeared, we had 4 associations of families and mothers. Their first priority was to reveal the fate and whereabouts of their beloved ones, So we managed to agree on several goals and several objectives, and we managed to agree on priorities when we took it from there, So it's not. So we didn't create a coalition. We created an objective-based coalition. We work on this particular issue together, and we work separately on other things. So if I would say a new conflict now is happening and victims are not organized, it's about providing them with the knowledge, with the tools, with the resources, and who are engaged will take it and will come forward, will be acting as they should. So yeah, this is how we do it.
Ram or Marjorie, do you want to add something?
Well, I think our situation has been somewhat different from what Ahmed has described, because we had this incredible nonviolent movement called the United Democratic Front. And so there had been enormous progress. The movement was called the Purple Shall Govern, because people were blasted with purple dyed water cannon. And that, I think there were all these opportunities of forging a solidarity that was incredibly helpful. Other issues around solidarity were launching the international lawsuit, Kulumani et al. Versus Barclays Bank et al., which became an incredibly important energizing tool for victims and survivors in the country.
Ram, I will move to you if you want to add something.
Yeah, I think on the question of fragmentation, there are in the transitional justice process, as I mentioned earlier, it's like mostly in the post-conflict states, they adopted a prescription tools, transitional justice as a menu, it's like a checklist, truth, justice, prosecution, reparation, blah, blah, but without victims, without their participation, without ensuring their agency, there is like a passive actors or participants, or observer like that way, that did not work, that we see and we experienced in our practices. So on the, needs and perspectives from the victims, from their own perspective, because the actors, they deeply, investigated or asked them, what are your priorities and what are the needs? How can we address together? How can we build it together? And so they didn't see their role in the processes. And so that's why I think, we need a very strong, an advocacy strategy. And that is very important for the victim movement and victim groups to articulate their demands, and also to create an actors chain together to create pressure to the authorities to fulfill their demand. That's one point. At another level, I think, we need to have a strategic communication together with victims. There is a communication gap, not only knowledge gap or the process gap. And so we need to, and convey the message, from the top to down, and also bring the voices from, bottom to the top, It's like a two-way communication. So we need a strategic communication. And so in the different processes, how we start, so at every level, we need to have a comprehensive process. The process, can ensure victim participation in a real level. And then also, various actors, they talk about victim participation, but also there are level of participation. For that we need to prepare victims, to actively participate in the process. And we must let them participate. As an actor in a dignified way. And so these are important. So that's why we need to build their capacity. We need to produce leadership, and then also we need to create a space for them where they can independently discuss their needs and convey their message to the authorities, and also build the real level of partnership, with the different partners in the also in the solidarity building processes. I think these are very important and key aspects of the justice processes.
Thank you, Ram. Lester, your question, please.
Hi. Thank you all for speaking English. It certainly is easy for me. But I'm kind of thinking about language and the problems we have with language, and both the terms for the persons whom we want to hear from and whom we want to have drive the process, and then also the concept of justice or the term of justice. Right. And so I liked Ram talked about victim survivors, and we kind of go back and forth, between victim and survivors. And it seems like the term survivors is very powerful, but then you also lose some of the impact of victim, because people really are victims. I once had a student recently talking about a movement that wouldn't use the term justice because of this perpetrator-led institutionalized notion of injustice, right? So I'm wondering, first, are there any solutions in other languages? We have the same problem with nonviolence. Some groups don't like nonviolence because they think it sounds too passive. But are there solutions in other languages than English for these problems of victim and justice? And I'm wondering also, of course, in the end, what matters is whether our language affects our perception and then our strategies and tactics. So thanks for this great discussion. I'm really enjoying it.
Thank you, Lester. I don't know, Ahmad or Ram, if you want to add something about sources or writings in different languages. Let me share from my Latin American background. The whole thing comes in Spanish. So sadly, we need to translate it into English in order to be able to have the conversation. And that already creates all sorts of problems. In my writings, the other thing, even in the academic world, sadly, we use other languages as a source of information for the facts, but not to develop the theoretical framework. So if I look into Spanish, I read, okay, here are the violations, the testimonies, this and that, but then I use the English sources to create the theoretical framework. And that's highly problematic. So that I appreciate your comment. I don't know, Ahmad or Ram or Marjorie, if you want to add something.
Okay, so very early on, in fact, in the campaign called Find Your Voice, people rejected the notion of being victims because actually they were the community activists always. And they said, if the Truth Commission forces us to present ourselves to victims' hearings or to make victim statements, we need to tell people, we need to tell the politicians and the Truth Commissioners that a victim is somebody who lost their life in the struggle. We are survivors. And but we were forced through the legislation that set up the Truth Commission to accept, the definition of the Truth Commission, that you're a victim of these killings, abductions, torture, and severe ill treatment, which were the 4 categories that we've used for building our databases, because we thought we had to comply with the definitions in the act that set up the Truth Commission. And I think it's really important. So very early on, when we wanted to create a slogan, the members of Kulumani said, our slogan will be victims transformed into active citizens. And that's really what we've lived into. I mean, everywhere in the world we see you can become basically paralyzed by agreeing that you're a victim. We worry about what goes on in Israel-Palestine conflict because we think that's based on notions of victimhood that have served nobody, So, that's the basis of our work. It is still very difficult to persuade people in political positions that Kulumani members have incredible agency. They are protagonists in their own lives. They create all these projects on the ground. They don't like that. They prefer that you're a victim. And in fact, at the time that the Truth Commission wound up, President Thabo Mbeki was very insulting about the idea of people being victims, even though the Truth Commission identified you as a victim, because he said we all knew that you would actually suffer immense harm if you were active in the struggle. So do not call yourselves a victim. And he said that particularly to the movement of combatants. But surprisingly, many, many combatants have joined Kulumani because they recognize that the harms were very, very severe and that you need to go through processes to deal with the trauma. About the disappeared, we have a huge movement of disappeared families of the disappeared. Up to now, there were about 450 cases of the disappeared reported to the Truth Commission, and about 90 of those cases have been resolved only because the people who disappeared and tortured and killed people, very few of them came forward to take advantage of the amnesty provisions of the Truth Commission. So it's an ongoing deep wound for people. And it takes immense resources to actually identify these graves. I mean, the one thing that they have succeeded in doing is exhuming the bodies of the activists who were hanged on the, they were accused of treason for fighting against the regime. And that was easier because all their graves were identifiable, and nearly all those people have been exhumed and their bodies returned to their families. So, but people who were buried anywhere else, it's very, very hard to identify where the graves are. It's an ongoing problem. In fact, we've got this morning we are discussing the issue of disappearances with the UN Office of the High Commission for Human Rights. It's a deeply unresolved matter. I think everywhere, like Syria and and Ram with his experience with families of the disappeared. It's a very, very sad phenomenon. Yeah. And human rights, well, I think when you speak about human rights, we found that at the time that we started producing these forms where people could register what happened to them, we actually printed out the human rights that were named in our constitution, and we asked people to think about which of these rights that are in the constitution were violated. And actually, quite serendipitously, we found people suddenly discovered, oh, you mean racial discrimination is a violation of a human right? It was completely accidental, and it was like a huge conscientization, and we never even realized what we were doing, So that was, we're very grateful for that. So we became part of a big campaign nationally called Know Your Constitution, because you can actually apply that constitution, and we have a very good constitutional court. So it was actually a miracle that it just happened.
I think, yeah, I mean, I completely, agree, with you and Ahmad, what you said earlier. And then this is very, I think, contested, issues, within victims movement and also between the, different actors. In our context also, at the beginning, we just use like those who were victimized by the state operation. They were as using the word as the beginning as a fighters, fighters for their rights. And then we use the term like a families, and then even we develop as the beginning during the conflict time. And then we form family associations, the families of the disappeared. And then even, some political groups, and then they even, they term their disappeared relatives as, warrior, So the families of the disappeared fighters, families of the disappeared warriors, that way we use. And then in the middle of the conflict, when ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross, started their work and intervention at different level, they just, coined the word missing. And then we had some problems at the beginning. Even with them in the program that, we are not, using the, I'm still not using the word missing, in my writing, in my, talking or things that, we thought that, this already, that's a, symbol of passivity, there is no political meaning. And so it's a political struggle, for the families of the disappeared. And then after the peace agreement, and then government used both words, in their compromise documents, because they were consulting with the foreign experts, even mostly in our transition, at the beginning, they followed, it's like a South African model is the very, comprehensive model. And even they invited some, consultant and expert from South Africa, from, United Nations, and then that's why even, we named our commission as a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, even the name borrowed by South Africa, it's a government and the policymakers will, heavily, influenced by their act. And at the end, we had a different, act, Transitional Justice Act, and government formed like a commission, and then they also defined the word missing in the Transitional Justice Act, but we registered it, we even like fired it in the street, and then we registered the case against the terminology in the Supreme Court. We don't want, we families, as a family member, we don't want to hear the word missing. Our relatives, our family members, they're not missing. You forcibly disappeared them, and then you torture them, and then you kill them inside the custody. And so that's why we resisted. And then we even registered the petition at the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court made a very positive verdict on behalf of families. And later the government corrected the word, and then they used enforced disappeared. Even in the commission, they named, as the enforced disappeared commission, like that. So it's like a quite successful story. And also in the terminology, mostly people used victims, and political parties, government, policymakers, they used, because when transition started, there were even, the victims or the, very marginalized groups, they're not heard, it's like a very expert-led, borrowed by the international actors and the donors, and then they started teaching civil society actors, and donors funded them, and they technically supported and created the set of elites in the capital. It's not the local people.
I'm so sorry that.
Yeah. That's the story. So that's why
we are running out of time.
And then people are, using the terminology mostly, what other taught us. That's the problem. It's a very contested issues, I think. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Ram. I'm so sorry that I have to play the role of the dictator here. Let me abuse of my power, and what I will do, we have 3 more questions and we have only 13 minutes. So I will put together the 3 questions. I apologize if I'm trying to be, as Ram said, being the translator of the voice of those who have questions. But these are the questions. Moise and Abel, I believe that they ask similar questions and are related to the paradox of human rights advocacy, that we have to work with governments, with the state, and the state are the perpetrators of the violence, but at the same time, they should be part of the solution. And how do we work in that context, in the context of violence, abuses, corruption from the government, but the need to engage part of the government to be part of the solution? Kathy asked, in this same context, when we want to embrace and create more opportunities for victims and survivors to participate, how do we deal with the ongoing violence, the violence against the victims, the survivors? How do we work in this context that in many places, like in Syria, the conflict is still ongoing? The fear even of the violence and the retaliation is very present. How do we work with the survivors of violence when they have to retell us their stories and they relieve the violence situation? So how do we deal with that, the voice of the victims and survivors in a violent context? And how do we protect that and create safe environments? So these 2 questions: how to work with the state and engage the state, how to work in a context of violence. And let's start with Ahmad, and let's try one more with Marjorie. And I ask the 3 of you if you can answer the question and also give us a final thought. Thank you so much.
Yeah, briefly, on the government who are like the authorities, or the government who is also the perpetrators, actually you don't have much of options. So you need to work with them. You need to work against them as well. Unfortunately, there is no enough or efficient international mechanisms or tools to use, or justice venues to employ. whatever in the international law or like the ICC, ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and like the Human Rights Council, they don't have the power to change anything on the ground. But you don't have much of options not to work with the government. But from my perspective, is always keep your target small, very, very small, but you build on it. So if you can target the whole government, target one individual. When you get rid of that individual, you go to the other. You know, it's just long-term, small steps tactics. On the victims' voices when they are under threat, let's remember that their activism, most probably their activism, led to them being victims. So their original identity is activist. Then they became victims. So they are still activists after that. So when you are asked them to speak up, they are not speaking up because of your question. They are speaking up because of their activism, and they know what the danger they are facing, and they did face it, and they will continue to face it.
Thank you, Ahmad. Ram or Marjorie? We lost Marjorie now.
Okay. In
Ram.
our in our context in Nepal, engaging with the states, even I mean during the commission process in 2014, government adopted a Transitional Justice Act, but with the amnesty provisions. And then it's a very, problematic. And then many civil society organizations and international actors, they mostly, adopted the non-cooperation strategy to the commission and the act. And then for the victims, and then we discuss a lot, to the grassroots. Even, we organize like a national conference, and then we consulted with the wider victim groups and the actors in the ground. And then we agreed and adopted that we need to register our cases officially, and then we need to try to maximize the benefits from the official processes. So we discussed and adopted a critical engagement position. So that's why after the 2014, we have been critically engaging with the processes, and then we have to also, we have been critically warning them and playing a role as a critical watchdog. That's our position. Working with the governments. That's also important. To maximize the benefits from those institutions, and also to warn them if there are mistakes and they are not including victims in the processes. We warn them, but our position is critical engagement on those cases. On the non-repetition, there's the processes are very important. So how the state or the non-state actors and then deal with the exclusionary process approach, they mostly they adopt like exclusion. This is a big problem. And the marginalization, without giving them a space and voice. These are more problematic. And so we try to mitigate those things and then build some process of dialogue, and then activate them together. And also we also adopted some processes on how to deal with differences. These are also important, not going through confrontation, but dealing with the differences in a tactical way, and then to also bring them together, to fight against injustices and for the same causes like the exclusion, marginalization, limited space, and all these things that we can expand together through a mutual dialogue process and the representation. And these are important in our case.
So the biggest difficulty for us has been the absolute resistance to our government, led by the African National Congress, to honor their undertakings that they would make right all the injustice that people had suffered. That has been the biggest problem. I think they've been caught up in there were so many things to do at the beginning of democracy, like reorganizing the geography of the country, incorporating 10 self-governing states into provinces. It was just a nightmare. They had to then incorporate all the people who had joined the liberation armies back into one they called it the National Defense Force because they all fought for their own liberation factions of the what would you call it, the opposition. We have a lot to do with these military formations because the state itself, we ended up through designing reparations policy proposals being asked by the military formations, please to share all our work with them. And they took that to Parliament and they won all the policy suggestions that we had made, which have never been afforded to the victims, survivors. So they've benefited from our work immensely. But it's a huge problem because it is an unresolved issue of equal fair treatment. So the people you have who decide who's going to get these benefits that we designed have their own political affiliation, so they only support people from their political faction. It's all this kind of extraordinarily difficult political privileging of certain groups. But we don't have any political affiliations in Kulumani, so they come to us, they ask us to give them workshops. I've ended up on project steering committees for military veterans, and actually then they say, but you're the only people who tell us what's really going on, So I think it's an interesting role to play, but there's so much still to win in this struggle, and you cannot just avoid the struggle. It has cost too many lives and too many atrocities, and I mean every week we on our group of members we are honoring massacres every week. See, massacres that the world doesn't even know about, but it's so important that there is that recognition and acknowledgement, because that's the beginning of healing. One of the things we did, and I mean, the people that you met, Ahmad and Ram and myself, were co-founders of this Innovas, and the what should you call it? The instigation of that movement is that transitional justice always makes survivors the losers everywhere in the world, and so how? I mean. When there was that paper that Simon Robbins and Paul Greedy, we wrote a concept document before we founded Innovas about how do you build a different system of transitional justice, because this system does not work on an inclusive basis. It does not deliver justice to victims. There are always losers in this system, and basically the people who are benefiting are mainly lawyers, and lawyers' solutions are very different from the solutions that come from the people. For instance, when we fought the apartheid litigation in New York, the big issue was to look at how in Peru and other parts of the world, the decisions are like, if this was your violation, if somebody disappeared, then you would be awarded so much compensation. In South Africa, it was like, don't divide us on the basis of what we suffered. We all suffered. We want everybody to be treated equally. That's one of the big issues, because it becomes such a technical legal solution, and it really doesn't work for people. And then you set up all the animosities about this person got so much and I only got so much, and who said that was a worse violation, all of that stuff that happens with the legal solutions. So we've advocated very, very strongly, and our lawyer, our attorney in Washington, D.C., Michael Hausfeld, was incredibly supportive of this kind of approach to reparations, because he had worked out the compensation reparation program to solve the Tulsa race riots in the south of the United States. And it was based on the understanding that Kulumani members resonate with, it's not like, well, setting up individual differences between people. We fought one struggle. We were there together, that's a big part for us. So TJ, largely based on the South African model, and it has become a very big industry that benefits a few people immensely. And like our truth commissioners have basically abandoned the struggle for reparations in South Africa. They are now pursuing only prosecution of apartheid perpetrators, using immense amounts of money that they are busy fundraising, and what's happening to all the living victims and survivors of all these atrocities, So we don't support that as a model at all. It needs to be a different model, and we tried to explain what we were thinking in our concept note for Innovas, which I'm happy to send you if you'd like it. Okay. The lawyers find us hard to work with because we don't agree with their legal solutions. South Africa is said to have the worst rate of gender-based violence in the world. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. And basically, because of the decades and decades of humiliation that have been suffered by men in this country, men who would love to be proud defenders of their families. They were forced into migrant labor, women brought up and looked after the elderly and kept the homes going. There's this terrible background of attitudes that have developed. There's been research about, so if you retrench like mine workers, which of course is the biggest industry in South Africa, if you retrench mine workers and they go back to rural communities and they don't have anything else except being the breadwinner who would be bringing the money home, how do you create a different identity? It's the same issue we face with military competence. You have a military identity that you're very proud of, but it's no longer relevant in this context today. So how do we create a civilian identity? We did a lot of work in trying to instill ways in which military combatants could make valuable contributions in their communities. One of the principles they say of African philosophy is that you become a full adult only when you are able to contribute to your community in meaningful ways. That's what's missing in this country. So basically, there are millions of men who have been humiliated, who are not able to earn anything. There are all the gender norms about who does what kind of work. And I think that's the biggest issue we face, like changing attitudes about, what is male work and what is female work, and how do we, I think it's a global phenomenon, but it's particularly treacherous in this country. With our long history of migrant labor and deliberate, humiliation of men. And I think it underlies all of the gender-based violence that we suffer. A colleague of mine with whom I worked in a big campaign called All Africa Women for Peace, she was a judge from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and she came to South Africa and ended up being a magistrate in a family court. And she said it was impossibly overwhelming because every single day she was dealing with 100 applications by women of what you would call no contact orders. And she said, how is that a solution? There's something much deeper going on. And in the end, she left the judiciary because she said we're not doing what is needed in transforming gender relations. And I think that is crucial. We need gender reconciliation. We need new ways of men and women being able to work together and respect and value each other. That's what's missing in this country. And every single day, women are being killed in this country. So yes, it's a huge issue.
So thank you so much for this amazing panel. There is a lot of things to think about. There is an implicit critique and challenge to all of us who are engaged in international advocacy, challenging us to think outside the box, to push the envelope, not to repeat more of the same. and at the same time, there is a lot to learn from your experiences, what you share with us, the call for a bottom-up approach, the call for creating more meaningful places to have the voice of the victims and survivors not only heard, but act upon them. And that's a problem. We don't want just more formal, symbolic places to have the voice, but what we want is a meaningful dialogue. And I think that that's a crucial aspect that we still need to work more on that. I will let Kathy to wrap up the meeting. Two self-promotions. One is I direct the Human Rights Clinic at the University of Texas, and we have the capacity to help and provide support to any of your organizations working. And so I'm happy to discuss the possibilities of supporting your advocacy. I'm typing now my email in case you want to reach out. My final message is what my university says, what starts here changes the world. And I truly believe that here we are changing the world. All of you are changing the world, and we all have the capacity to contribute to changing the world. So thank you for letting me be part of this effort. And Kathy, it's all yours.
Gracias. Thank you so much, Ariel. That was such an uplifting and wonderful final kind of wrap up and message of this really great panel and webinar and all the wisdom and learning that we've done together. I really appreciate it and appreciate your offer of tools and assistance at the University of Texas at Austin. I mentioned earlier that you had been on the Peace Brigades International Human Rights group, and I know there are amazing resources. We use them a lot for Colombia and Guatemala and other countries that at that time that we had human rights defenders working on. So I hope people will definitely get in touch with you. I want to thank everyone today for being part of this. It's been a really great interactive process, and especially the panelists, Ram Bandari, Ahmad Helmi, Marjorie Jobson. And I want to thank all the participants for the insightful questions and the work that you're all doing. It's clear that you're all very involved as well. Our Solidarity 2020 and Beyond team, Waging Nonviolence, our partnership with them has been really great for a lot of these series of webinars. And to let you know that we'll be having some really interesting ones coming up in January, February. The Occupied Peoples Alliance and Coalition will be putting another panel forward. We'll be talking to some of the Iranian women that are working on that uprising and nonviolent revolution for their rights. Another important part of the Middle East right now, that things that are happening there, and also a wrap up on the COP and climate crisis for a number of our activist members that were there in Egypt, and such important connections with human rights and climate justice and climate rights and environmental justice. So we've got a lot of things coming up. We really appreciate your support for being here. And again, it just gives me hope on this International Human Rights Week, because this is a long, long journey, a very costly struggle for some more than others. We've heard Ahmad's experience. Ram's been through a lot in his own family. I'm sure Marjorie has as well. Marjorie, and I know Ariel and his family in Argentina and others on the call. So we just, again, we always see, and our slogan, together is stronger, together we're better. And that's what we have to keep fighting the struggle for rights and justice and peace. So thank you everyone for joining, and it's a wrap.